COVID-19 vaccine pass requirements are triggering much controversy across the globe. Here in Korea, legal dispute is ongoing, while over in Europe, public protests are underway. For more, I have Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University. Professor Cho, it's a pleasure to see you again.
It's good to see you too.
I also have Professor David Kwak from Sooncheng University. Welcome back, Professor Kwak.
Good afternoon.
Right, Professor Cho, we'll start with you then. Perhaps we can start actually with a few words on the legal debate over vaccine passes here in the country.
There are currently two live lawsuits that are ongoing before the courts. One has been brought mostly by parents of students against this administrative order, which essentially mandates people who don't have vaccine passes, i.e. people who are not fully vaccinated, from being able to use places like hagwons, academies, study cafes, even schools. But that was actually not due to come into effect until March. But the parents, the order has already been made, and the parents who felt that this was not quite the right thing to do for the students challenged the order, and the administrative court actually issued an injunction suspending the operation of the order until the courts had a chance to hear the full arguments by both sides and for the judgment of the court to be issued. So I think it will be some days or perhaps a couple of weeks before we will actually hear the judgment. The government has actually immediately challenged the injunction, and so that hearing is ongoing. Mm-hmm. The second lawsuit has been brought by, I think there's about 1,000 claimants, mostly small and medium-sized businesses, particularly those who have been affected by the social distancing orders and closures of shops and also early closing hours and so forth. But it also includes some medical professionals who do not necessarily agree with the institution of vaccine passes. As you know, we've had this vaccine pass come into effect from, I think, yesterday. So we cannot visit, even supermarkets without actually, showing a vaccine pass. And so that's under a constitutional challenge now.
Right. And Professor Kwak, you've been quite vocal about your opposition to vaccine mandates, but you do support vaccinations themselves. Now, as a medical professional, what are your thoughts on the need for vaccine passes?
Well, I guess I'm going to repeat myself once again here. Even though I do think that, and professionally speaking as well, the vaccines are necessary for our own protection. It has a definite proof that it protects us from having severe forms of the disease, let alone dying from the disease. So I do think it's necessary, and I think all people around the world should be educated and informed well enough that they would decide to receive the vaccines for their own benefit. However, the matter of mandate on it should be separate from the scientific proof or even the information we currently have, because with a mandate, I think there also needs to be a responsibility taken by the party that mandates the other. And just recently, I've been seeing a lot of patients coming into the clinic really suffering through mild side effects, not the severe forms or something that puts them in a hospital bed, but rather a chronic, severe pain that they've been having for the past couple of months ever since they received vaccines. I'm not saying vaccines cause these mild symptoms to everyone, but there are numerous cases where people have a sort of a symptom which is not clearly explained, and that can be pinpointed to the vaccination, but will be strong enough that these people would decide not to go ahead with further schedule of vaccines. And I'm in a position still informing that the vaccine still would further benefit them, but I cannot make them decide for their own to be mandated to receive the vaccine. So that's where my position comes from, where I say, even though vaccines are still necessary to protect us, to all of us, I still don't think that it should be mandated.
Right, and before we delve further into the local situation, let's take a moment to venture beyond national borders over to France, where tens of thousands took to the streets this past weekend to denounce a proposed law that demands proof of vaccination to dine out, to travel on intercity trains and to attend cultural events. For more, I have Clovis Casali live on the line. It's a pleasure to have you on, Clovis.
Good morning.
Right, now let's begin with some background behind this latest hardline stance with regard to COVID-19 vaccine passes by the government.
Well, basically, there are rising and worrying cases here in France. For yesterday alone, we're talking 93,000 new cases of COVID-19. So what does that mean? Well, the government, the French government and the President Emmanuel Macron, of course, wants to reduce the pressure on hospitals. Make sure that some people who need vital treatment for cancer or other will actually get a place in hospital, because hospitals are not yet saturated, but depending on the areas of France, it's a very serious problem. So what is the French government doing? Well, they're trying to increase furthermore the level of vaccination in the country, this in order to reduce the number of hospitalizations. And as you said, there were demonstrations. Very tricky context here. A lot of opposition in France with a few words from the French President Emmanuel Macron saying he wants to emmerde the ones who do not get vaccinated. I'm not going to specifically translate what that word means, but it's rather a rude way of saying that he wants to bother as much as possible those who are not yet vaccinated.
Right, and what has been the general response, that is, to this tough stance by the government and to Emmanuel Macron's rather colloquial way of saying he seeks to, is it irritate or annoy those who are not vaccinated?
Absolutely, and those are not words that Emmanuel Macron usually uses. Well, last weekend, around 100,000 people all across France demonstrating, gathering on the streets in order to protest against this new vaccine mandate, the vaccine pass, as we call it here, replacing the previous sanitary pass. Well, it means that people will have to get vaccinated here in the country in order to go to shops, take part in various entertainment, to be able to go to stadiums, and so on. There are also rules that mean that basically people can get checked. Not just their passes, but also ID papers, because what you've been getting here is people who are opposed to these measures just getting a fake vaccine pass or one of someone else and not having to prove their identity at the same time. So it proved pretty unsuccessful for those who are so opposed to these measures. Why are they opposed? Because they say these measures are curbing their freedom, liberties, that it's completely unfair. A lot of people, a lot of those people believe that vaccines don't work, and that especially younger people should not be subjected to a vaccination because they are not at risk of developing serious forms of COVID-19. So that's their argument. You also have parents saying that children should not be forced to get vaccinated, that there is no point, they are not at risk. Worth pointing out that France has a very good level of vaccination. We're talking around 75% of the people here fully vaccinated, but clearly the government wants to do more in order always to reduce the number of people in hospital for COVID-19 reasons.
Right. So staying with that, the lower house, I understand, of the parliament has passed the controversial bill, and the government hopes to implement it in mid-January, the 15th of January to be precise. But I hear the Senate may delay the process. What more can you tell us, Clovis?
The Senate might delay the process just the way the National Assembly, which is the lower chamber, but the more important one, did in previous days. It seems very unlikely that the bill will not pass in the Senate. It will go through. It will be a matter of days. Yesterday, the government spokesperson, Gabriel Attal, said that we spoke of the date of January 15th. It might be the week of January 17th, because some minor changes to the bill might be introduced regarding the age. For instance, they're saying that maybe only children over the age of 16 on school outings will have to prove a vaccine mandate, that it might depend on the level of infections, depending on the regions of France. There might be localized, regionalized, if you will, minor changes, but the core essence of the bill will very much stay the same, and it will be introduced in the coming days. Basically, the just strengthening of measures, more controls in order to be sure that more French people get vaccinated. And all of this, of course, in a context of presidential campaign. You might be aware, that there's a very important ballot coming up in France here in April, the French presidential election. Emmanuel Macron standing for re-election, and all of these measures, his handling of the COVID-19 crisis, will be under scrutiny and will be, of course, at the heart of the campaign.
Right, Clovis, one very final quick question there. Do the unvaccinated in France have the option of handing a negative PCR test to access dining establishments and cultural events, as is the case here in Korea?
Yes, but with the new bill, that will change in most cases. There are some exceptions. For instance, if you need to go and see a parent, for instance, who's in a critical medical condition, there are various exemptions in that respect, and also that is basically, it will also depend on how security forces implement these measures. But in some specific cases, negative PCR tests will be accepted, but widely for most gatherings, for most activities, supermarkets and so on, you will need to show a vaccination. It might be one dose depending on the company. It might be 2 doses depending, of course, on the vaccine company, the type of vaccine that you're using.
I see. All right, Clovis, thank you for making the time to join us live at this very early hour at your end with your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, back here on the local front, Professor Cho, as you mentioned earlier this month, a Seoul Administrative Court called for the holding off of vaccine pass requirements for teenagers to access private venues of academic purposes. Mm-hmm. Do tell us a bit about the legal grounds for this ruling and its potential implications.
So the Administrative Court found that the vaccine pass mandate was not proven to be necessary or proportionate in this instance. What the order saying that people who don't have vaccine pass cannot access these educational facilities is doing is in fact infringing one of the basic rights that are protected by the Constitution, which is right to education. But before that, Clovis mentioned in his report that in France they call vaccine pass mandate simply vaccine mandate. But there's actually a little bit of difference, because obviously a vaccine pass mandate means that you have to have a vaccine pass. But in order to have a vaccine pass, you obviously need to be vaccinated. So basically what a vaccine pass mandate does is to mandate being vaccinated via back door. So the government is not saying to you, you have to be vaccinated. It's not making vaccination compulsory, but they are making vaccine pass compulsory to do all these everyday things like going for your grocery shopping, going to school, attending academies, going to study cafes. So all of those daily activities that you would do in a normal daily life, those are now requiring these vaccine passes. And so it's really impinging and infringing on our movements, our right to lead a normal daily life with human dignity. If you are being denied access to grocery shopping, this is basically denying you right to life. You can't eat, you can't live, right? And for students, as I said, right to education. And one of the most fundamental rights that we have is right to our bodies, our bodily freedom. And if you are being jabbed by a needle with some foreign fluid into your body, that's basically an assault and battery and causing grievous bodily harm unless you give your informed consent. This is what Professor Kwak mentioned earlier. And so this is why informed consent is so necessary. And when these basic rights clash, so we have the right to health and the government's duty to ensure public welfare and health, versus individuals' right to all these freedoms and rights that they should enjoy under the Constitution. The impingement or the curtailment of those basic rights should be necessary and proportionate to the risk that we are facing. And the court found that the administrative order with regard to the vaccine pass mandate for educational facilities simply was not proportionate, and they didn't think it was necessary at this point in time, which is why they issued the injunction.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Jo, what looks to be the impact of this latest order by the court on future legal disputes over vaccine passes?
So, because we don't have a system of legal precedents in our country, the administrative court's decision is not going to be binding on any other courts. Also because it's a lower court, it's a trial court rather than an appeals court. Their decisions don't really have any binding force. But I have heard quite a few medical professionals expressing concern that given this injunction issued by the court, there is a danger that other such administrative orders that are issued by the government to try to protect public health will be much more easily challenged by people in the future, and the courts may be much more willing and ready to suspend those orders pending, full hearing and decision, and that's going to essentially impact on the efficacy and the effectiveness of these various measures that they're trying to take for public health. But I would say that this particular administrative order that's been issued really wasn't thought through very carefully, and also it was possibly a bit too premature. And so this may actually motivate the government to think a little bit more carefully and consider things in a more broad manner before issuing those orders.
Right. And staying with what Professor Cho has just mentioned, Professor Kwak, as a medical professional yourself, there are concerns, of course, that this latest order by the court, as Professor Cho has mentioned, may, broadly speaking, cast doubt on the government's containment strategy. What are your thoughts?
Well, so once again, I want to iterate that there needs to be a clear distinction of necessity of vaccines against the mandates. Even though the vaccines do clearly do benefits to everybody who it's inoculated to, the mandate itself, as Professor Cho already mentioned, the proportion of the benefits that we would get from mandating everyone to have received vaccines before entering certain venues is, I'm quite doubtful that it is going to benefit all of us in the manner that it'll stop the spreading to other people. There have been numerous studies that actually prove those vaccinated are less likely to transmit to others, but still this stays more of a protection to people from not going into the severe forms or dying from it, but rather than transmitting to other people, especially when we're having issues like breakthrough cases, even for those who receive booster shots. And that's, I think, is going to become even more common once the Omicron hits our country. So looking even forward, I think mandating everyone to show passes because they received vaccines, as opposed to receiving vaccines for our own protection, needs to be clearly distinctive.
Right, because nobody likes to be told what to do, right? Professor Cho, as part of efforts now to appease current public discontent, authorities are looking to expand the list of vaccine exemptions. How do you respond to this move?
How effective is that going to be? Because no list of exemptions is ever going to be complete. And it's really, they're coming up with these ad hoc measures to try to quell discontent. And this, again, shows how they haven't really thought this through. And once again, I come back to the point that what they're essentially doing is mandating vaccine, but through a back door. And so this is what they want to do. Then they should really pass a law that mandates vaccine and actually, set out in a much more great detail about what the exemptions are going to be, what the government is going to do if people do suffer side effects, rather than these kind of ad hoc schemes that they implement now. And also, as Professor Kwak mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to prove cause and effect between the side effects that you experience and the vaccines themselves. So what's the government going to do, if in those cases? So those are the kind of things that they really need to be debated, discussed, and looked at. And we don't really have sufficient data, I think, for the government to do this. And this is why I think they're going through this kind of backdoor way of, mandating a vaccine pass rather than mandating vaccines, but that's really not the right way.
Right, and against the legal proceedings that are underway, Professor Kwak, there are some people who've actually postponed their booster shots as they await the results of these legal proceedings. What are your thoughts on the postponement of booster shots? We currently have 41%, I believe, of the population that has received a booster shot.
So that's for the more why we need to make that clear distinction between these vaccine passes and its protection that is going to protect us. So if I may share a little bit of personal experiences with my colleagues and whatnot, we are clearly seeing clinical symptoms of these people who have also been vaccinated with certain types of vaccines to even still get sicker. So those people who has not received, let's say, booster shots with an mRNA type of vaccine, but received a certain type of vaccines before, even with their completion, they still do get very sick and can also be sick enough to get admitted to ICU. So booster shots, currently speaking, as a medical doctor, which is still needed. Booster shots, with the waning of prior completion of vaccines, waning of immunity, that is, they're not going to be big enough or powerful enough to protect you further when after a certain time of period has passed. So the booster shots now has become necessary, but that doesn't still mean that it's necessary to go into different daily activities. But booster shot, medically speaking, is still definitely needed. And I would once again strongly recommend to all those who are watching this to receive their booster shots when the time comes to protect their own selves. Quite separate from the governmental mandate.
Right, of course. Professor Cho, I understand this might be a tough question, but given the current scenario here in the country, what do you propose perhaps to tackle this issue that we're having with the public, or with the members of the public that is, and the government with regard to vaccine passes?
So I think we have to challenge the assumption that vaccine passes are necessary, which seems to be the assumption that government has already made by mandating vaccine pass. Professor Kwak has already given numerous examples, but what does vaccine pass actually add, apart from simply making it easier to verify or identify who has been vaccinated and who hasn't? But what is to say that those people who have been vaccinated, as opposed to those who have been unvaccinated but are tested negative or have actually had COVID, that they are at greater risk of infecting other people? And on top of that, we also have breakthrough infections, right? So even if you are vaccinated, that doesn't actually, exempt you from exposed to risk or exposing other people to risk. So what does vaccine pass really add? And also, in different circumstances and different environments, the risk of being infected is so different, in schools, in cafes, in restaurants, as opposed to in supermarkets and outdoor venues. And so you really need to have the appropriate measure of protection for that particular environment, rather than saying, oh, vaccine pass, you're through. No vaccine pass, you can't come in. That is simply not the right way to manage this. And in fact, vaccine pass could be detrimental to having proper measures to protect ourselves, because people might be lulled into false sense of security, thinking, oh, I've been vaccinated, I have my vaccine pass, and so I'm okay to go everywhere. I don't need a mask even, for example. So I would say the government really has to rethink their policy regarding vaccine pass and go back to the drawing board.
Right. Professor Cho, as always, thank you very much for your insights. Professor Kwak, thank you for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.